To the future, Tyler roared, lifting a glass of 20-year single malt scotch that belonged to my father. The fire snapped and hissed inside the stone hearth, throwing long, restless shadows across the timber walls of our ancestral cabin. The room glowed warm and golden, the kind of light that makes bad ideas feel historic. "I got the final permit signed off this morning," Tyler announced, his voice swelling with the kind of confidence only possessed by men who have never paid for their own mistakes. "We gut this outdated interior, swap it for floor-to-ceiling glass, heated floors, clean lines. By spring, we flip it for 780 grand profit." My father, David, slapped him on the back, grinning like he was witnessing destiny unfold. My sister, Sarah, stared at her husband with open admiration, like he'd just rewritten the laws of physics. I sat off to the side, a mug of lukewarm coffee cooling in my hands, saying nothing at all. Because what Tyler didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the deed to this cabin was locked inside a fireproof safe in my apartment 3 hours away. And my name had been printed on it for 5 years. Before we watch Tyler's house of cards collapse, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The cheering inside the cabin was overwhelming. It wasn't just excitement, it was relief. My father saw Tyler's grand plan as rescue. A way to transform a dormant family property into generational wealth. He saw the tailored suit, the booming voice, the audacity, and mistook it for capability. When he looked at Tyler, he saw momentum. When he looked at me, quiet, observant, wrapped in a plain gray sweater, he saw nothing worth noticing, just Ashley, the accountant, the careful one. The one without vision. My phone buzzed against my leg, one sharp vibration, precise enough to cut through the noise. I glanced down discreetly. "Unknown number. Are you Ashley? I'm Antonio. I'm outside your cabin. Your brother-in-law owes me $18,000. My stomach dropped. My face didn't change. Forensic accounting had taught me a single immutable rule: never reveal your position before the board is set. I stood, slipped through the French doors, and stepped onto the porch. The mountain air hit me hard, icy and unforgiving, freezing the breath in my lungs. Snow fell thick and steady, drifting down into the dark spines of pine trees beyond the clearing. I looked back through the glass. Inside, my father poured Tyler another drink. Sarah laughed, her hand resting proudly on Tyler's arm. It looked perfect, a family bound together by a shared illusion. And standing there in the cold, I finally confronted the question I'd avoided for years. Why? Why did my father trust the loud performer over the quiet protector? Families like ours fall into this trap constantly. We confuse confidence with competence. We interpret silence as absence. Tyler filled rooms with noise, energy, promises, spectacle. He demanded attention, so he received respect. I demanded nothing. I solved problems quietly, paid debts without announcements, cleaned messes in the dark. And because I made disasters disappear without drama, my father assumed there were no disasters at all. He didn't value stability. He valued excitement. I looked back at my phone. "I'm outside," I typed, coming down. I wasn't just walking into the snow to meet a contractor. I was stepping out of the role they'd assigned me. The quiet daughter was done. The forensic accountant was clocking in. The next morning, I sat in a vinyl booth at the only diner in town, watching steam curl off a mug of black coffee. Antonio arrived 2 minutes late, eyes tired, shoulders sagging, a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. He didn't look like a con artist. He looked like a man who knew he'd been played. Without preamble, he slid into the booth and pushed his phone toward me. He said he wanted open concept, Antonio muttered. "So we started demo yesterday." The image on the screen stole my breath. The great room, its hand-hewn beams, the timber my mother used to trace with her fingertips while reading by the fire was gone, ripped out, tossed into a dumpster like scrap wood. Tyler hadn't renovated the cabin. He degutted its soul. He erased decades of history to make space for sterile modern design that photographed well and meant nothing. The anger that settled in me wasn't hot, it was glacial. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own folder. "Antonio," I said calmly, "Tyler Collins does not own that cabin. He never has. He's never paid property tax on it, and he certainly didn't inherit it." I slid the deed across the scratched laminate table, the date 5 years earlier. "I bought it," I continued as his eyes widened. "When my mother died, my father stopped opening mail. Grief shut him down. The bank was weeks from foreclosure. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't tell him how I drained my savings to clear the arrears, how I transferred the title quietly to protect the property from creditors. How I let my father believe it was still the family cabin because stripping him of that belief felt cruel. I'd been the silent investor in their happiness for half a decade, and this was my reward. He lied to you, I said evenly, and he destroyed my property. You're stopping work immediately, and you're giving me every message, email, and voicemail he sent you. Antonio swallowed. He owes me 18 grand. He owes you more than that, I replied. But first, he's about to learn the landlord is home. I drove down the mountain with evidence riding shotgun, my thoughts shifting from defense to offense. But before I pulled the trigger, I gave my sister one chance. Sarah had always been the dreamer, vision boards, manifestations, belief without verification. I needed to know if she was complicit or collateral damage. We met at a coffee shop near her house. She arrived glowing, buzzing with manic optimism, the kind that precedes impact. Can you believe it? She gushed, grabbing my hands. Tyler says presale interest is insane. We're finally going to be rich. I pulled my hands away. Sarah, listen, I was at the cabin. He's destroying it, she waved me off. He's updating it. You have to break a few eggs. It isn't his to update, I said quietly, and he hasn't paid the contractor. He's 18,000 in debt. Her smile cracked, then hardened. He's managing cash flow. You're risk averse. You wouldn't understand. I understand he forged permits, I said. And I understand he doesn't own the property, she snapped. Why can't you just be happy for us? You're jealous. Tyler dreams big. You hide behind spreadsheets. Then she dropped it. We took a second mortgage, she said defiantly, to bridge the gap. I stared at her. She deleveraged her children's home to fund a renovation on a house I owned, based on a lie told by a man drowning in debt. Tyler hadn't just conned a contractor. He'd used my sister's trust as a shovel. He lied to you, I said softly. You're trying to ruin this, she hissed, standing. Stay out of our way. She left me alone with cold coffee and absolute clarity. This wasn't about a cabin anymore. It was about preventing my sister from losing her home. The sister left the table. Only the forensic accountant remained. I didn't go home to cry. I went home to work. I opened my laptop and logged into databases most people don't know exist. They thought I was passive. They were about to learn that Ashley, the accountant, wasn't a job title. It was a threat assessment. I ran the asset search. Tyler Collins. The screen flooded red. Unsecured debt, $57,600. Credit cards, gambling losses, luxury car lease, minimum payments stacked like a collapsing tower. He was drowning. And like any drowning man, he'd grabbed the nearest flotation device, my sister, and dragged her under. The second mortgage wasn't strategy, it was survival. I printed everything, bankruptcy filings. A lien from a failed business. It wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern of failure masked by charisma. But while the digital paper trail was damning, it wasn't enough to stop him instantly. To get the police involved, to get an immediate arrest that would physically remove him from my property before he did more damage, I needed proof of criminal intent. I needed to prove he wasn't just a bad businessman, but a thief. I grabbed my coat and keys. The digital audit was complete. It was time for the physical inspection. I drove back up the winding mountain road, the tires crunching on the fresh snow. The silence in the car was heavy, filled only by the hum of the engine and the cold realization that my brother-in-law wasn't just a liar. He was a parasite. The cabin was silent when I arrived. Antonio had followed my instructions perfectly. The work site was abandoned. The front door was unlocked. Tyler's arrogance apparently didn't extend to basic security. I stepped inside. The smell of sawdust and drywall dust hitting me instantly. It looked like a war zone. The walls I had painted with my mother were stripped to the studs. The floorboards were covered in debris. But I didn't stop in the main room. I walked straight to the master bedroom, to the spot above the fireplace where a large oil painting of the Rockies used to hang. The painting was on the floor, leaning against the wall. The wall safe behind it, a small vintage box installed by my grandfather in the 60s, was wide open. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. I walked over, my boots echoing on the subfloor, and peered inside, empty. The velvet pouches were gone. My mother's vintage jewelry collection, the sapphire brooch she wore to weddings, the pearl string from her grandmother, the gold locket with my father's picture, all of it gone. I leaned against the cold stone of the fireplace, a wave of nausea rolling over me. This wasn't just renovation fraud, this was grand larceny. But as the forensic accountant in my brain took over, the pieces clicked into a terrifying psychological profile. This is the nature of the narcissistic injury. Tyler didn't steal the jewelry just because he needed $57,000. He stole it because he needed the costume of a successful man. He couldn't bear the psychological wound of being seen as a failure as less than, so he looted our history to pay for his present. He pawned my mother's legacy to buy the appearance of wealth, the champagne, the suits, the contractor deposits. He would rather be a criminal than be ordinary. He would rather destroy my family than admit he was broke. This was the point of no return. He hadn't just made a bad business deal, he had violated the sanctuary of the people who loved him. He had stolen the physical memory of my mother to feed his ego. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the empty safe. Then I called the local precinct. "I need to report a burglary," I said. My voice as cold as the mountain air, and I know exactly who did it. The sister who hesitated at the coffee shop was gone. The woman standing in the wreckage of her mother's bedroom was ready to burn the house down to save it. 2 hours later, the snow was falling in sheets. A white curtain isolating the cabin from the rest of the world, but inside, the lights were blazing. Tyler wasn't hiding, he was doubling down. Through the window, I could see him pacing the great room, gesturing wildly to my father and a stranger in a suit. Likely the private investor, he was trying to scam for a bridge loan to cover his debts before the law caught up. He was trying to sell a house he didn't own to pay off a debt he couldn't service. It was the final desperate spin of the roulette wheel. I didn't knock. I used my key, the one I had carried on my keychain for 5 years, unnoticed by everyone. The door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing wind. The conversation died instantly. Tyler spun around, his closer smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he tried to recover. "Ashley, great timing, we're just wrapping up some." "No," I said, my voice cutting through his noise like a blade. "We are closing." I stepped aside. Behind me, Antonio walked in, looking grim. And behind him, 2 uniformed officers from the county sheriff's department. The color drained from Tyler's face so fast he looked like a ghost. "What is this?" "A prank, Ashley, this is a business meeting. It's an intervention," I said, walking to the table where he had spread out his fake blueprints. I dropped a heavy file folder onto the wood. It landed with the dull thud of a gavel. "This is the deed to the property," I said, pointing to the first document registered in my name, purchased from the estate 5 years ago. "These are the building permits you forged. The permit numbers belong to a parking garage in Denver." And this, I pulled out the pawn shop receipts I had retrieved from the police report database an hour ago. "This is the ticket for Mom's sapphire brooch and her pearl string and the gold locket." The silence in the room was absolute. My father, David, picked up the pawn receipt. His hands were shaking. He looked at the date stamp 3 days ago, then he looked at Tyler. The hero worship in his eyes died, replaced by a horror so deep it looked like physical pain. "You stole her jewelry," my father whispered. "To pay for what?" "For the appearance," I answered for him. Because looking rich was more important to him than being honest. Tyler crumbled. The arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a terrified small man. He turned to my sister, Sarah, who was standing by the kitchen island, clutching her stomach. "Sarah, baby, tell them it's a misunderstanding. I can fix this, I just need a little time." Sarah looked at him, then at me, and for the first time in her life, she didn't make an excuse for him. She stepped back. "Mr. Collins," the officer said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and grand larceny." As the handcuffs clicked, Tyler started screaming, blaming the market. Blaming the contractor, blaming me. But as they dragged him out into the snowstorm, his voice faded, swallowed by the wind. The cabin was finally quiet. The glass castle had shattered. A week later, the only sound in the cabin was the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper. Antonio was working on the timber frames, carefully restoring the wood Tyler had tried to cover up. It smelled like cedar and sawdust, the smell of healing. My father sat in the armchair by the fire. He looked older, deflated. The illusion that had sustained him, the idea that his son-in-law was a titan of industry, was gone. "I owe you an apology," he said, staring into the flames. I listened to him because he was loud. "I ignored you because you were quiet. I thought you didn't care about this place." I sat down opposite him. I didn't offer him tea or comfort. I offered him the truth. "Dad, look at this place," I said gently. "If I hadn't bought this cabin 5 years ago, the bank would have foreclosed on it. It would be a rental property for strangers right now. If I hadn't stepped in last week, Tyler would have leveraged Sarah's house into foreclosure too. You would be destitute. Sarah would be homeless, the jewelry would be gone forever. This is the reality of the world without the quiet ones. If I hadn't been the silent guardian, the safety net he didn't know existed, the family legacy would have been sold for scrap metal to pay for Tyler's ego. My silence wasn't absence, Dad, I said. It was a shield, he nodded slowly, tears tracking through the lines on his face. I see you now, Ashley, I see you. Later that afternoon, I stood on the newly restored deck. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. The jewelry was back in the safe I had paid to retrieve it myself. Sarah had filed for divorce and was staying with me until she got on her feet. The cabin was secure. I wrapped my hands around a hot mug of coffee and took a deep breath of the thin, clean mountain air. Ethan had wanted to flip this view for a quick profit to show the world how smart he was. Instead, he showed the world exactly who he was, and I had stopped him without raising my voice. I watched the first stars appear above the tree. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most complete. If this story reminded you that the quietest people often hold the most power, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, would you have pressed charges against family or let them walk?